For 12 years, everyone believed the story. A billionaire's only son, born unable to hear or speak. A tragic condition that stole his voice before he could ever use it. The father became a public figure, fighting for a cure, begging the world to help unlock the funds that could save his boy. Cameras followed him everywhere. People cried watching his interviews. But there was one person who saw something different. A housemaid who had raised the child since he was a baby. She noticed things that didn't match the story. Small details that made her uncomfortable. And when she was suddenly accused of a crime she didn't commit, everything began to unravel. What happened next shocked a courtroom full of people and exposed a secret so dark, it changed everything. The boy who had never spoken a single word in public finally opened his mouth. Not to ask for help, but to tell the truth his father had buried for over a decade. Before we continue with this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Thomas Garrett was not just wealthy. He was powerful. His name appeared on buildings across the state. Shopping centers, office towers, luxury hotels. He had built an empire from the ground up, starting with a small construction company and turning it into one of the largest real estate firms in the country. People respected him. Business leaders sought his advice. Politicians attended his fundraising dinners. Thomas had influence and he knew how to use it. But despite all his success, there was one part of his life that the public saw as tragic. His son, Oliver. Thomas told the world that Oliver was born with a severe neurological disorder. The condition, he explained, left Oliver completely deaf and unable to speak. No sound had ever reached the boy's ears. No words had ever left his lips. Doctors, Thomas claimed, had tried everything. Specialists from different countries examined Oliver. Experimental treatments were attempted. Nothing worked. Oliver remained silent, trapped in a world without sound or voice. Thomas spoke about this often. He did interviews on national television. He appeared at charity events for children with disabilities. He gave speeches at medical conferences. Every time he told the same story. His son was suffering. Medical science had failed him. But there was hope. A new research program in Europe was developing a breakthrough therapy. It used advanced technology to stimulate damaged nerves in the brain. Early trials showed promise. Children who had never heard before were beginning to respond to sounds. Some even started speaking simple words. Thomas said this therapy could change Oliver's life. It could give him a future. But there was a problem. The therapy was extremely expensive. It required months of treatment in specialized facilities overseas. The cost was in the millions. Even for someone as wealthy as Thomas, it was a significant amount. But money wasn't the real obstacle. The real problem was access to a medical research fund that had been set up years earlier by a group of philanthropists. The fund contained over $50 million, specifically designated for rare neurological conditions in children. Oliver's case fit the criteria perfectly. According to the fund's rules, he should have been eligible for full financial support. But there was a legal complication. The organization that controlled the fund was involved in a dispute with government regulators. Questions had been raised about how the money was being managed. There were allegations of misuse, though nothing had been proven. Because of the investigation, all funds were frozen. No money could be released to anyone until the legal issues were resolved. That could take years. Thomas couldn't wait that long. He said the therapy had a narrow window. Oliver was 12 years old. The doctors said the treatment would be most effective before he turned 13. After that, the chances of success dropped significantly. Time was running out. Thomas launched a public campaign. He hired a public relations team. He appeared on morning shows, news programs, and podcasts. He spoke with emotion, his voice breaking at key moments. He talked about holding Oliver as a baby, wondering if his son would ever hear his voice. He described watching other children play and laugh while Oliver sat alone in silence. He painted a picture of a father doing everything possible to save his child. The campaign worked. People across the country were moved. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like Help Oliver and Unlock the Funds trended for weeks. Celebrities shared the story. Donations poured into a separate account Thomas had set up for legal fees. He said he needed the money to fight the bureaucracy holding up the research fund. Every dollar, he promised, would go toward getting Oliver the treatment he deserved. Thomas also hired one of the best lawyers in the state. Her name was Monica Pierce. She was known for winning impossible cases. She had taken on corporations, government agencies, and powerful institutions. She never backed down. When Thomas approached her, she immediately agreed to help. She said Oliver's case was exactly the kind of fight she lived for. A child's life hanging in the balance while legal red tape delayed justice. Monica worked tirelessly. She filed motions in court. She requested emergency hearings. She argued that the investigation into the fund should not prevent a dying child from receiving care. She pointed out that Oliver's condition met all the eligibility requirements. She presented medical records, doctor's statements, and expert testimony. She made passionate speeches in front of judges, demanding they prioritize a child's life over administrative concerns. The media covered every step. Cameras followed Monica into courtrooms. Reporters asked her questions on the courthouse steps. She always had a statement ready. She spoke with confidence and conviction. People admired her dedication. Online forums praised her for standing up to the system. Some called her a hero. But despite all the attention, despite all the legal pressure, the court moved slowly. Judges reviewed documents. Lawyers for the fund's oversight committee raised objections. They argued that releasing money to one individual while the investigation was ongoing would set a dangerous precedent. They said the rules existed for a reason and couldn't be bypassed, even in emotional cases. Monica fought back hard. She accused them of hiding behind bureaucracy. She said they cared more about protecting their reputations than saving a child. Her arguments were sharp and direct. The courtroom became a battleground. Thomas attended every hearing. He sat in the front row, always wearing a dark suit, his face serious and tired. He never smiled. He rarely spoke to anyone except Monica. When reporters asked him questions outside, he kept his answers short. He said he just wanted justice for his son. He said he didn't understand why it had to be so complicated. People believed him. Back at the Garrett mansion, life was very different from what the public saw. The house was enormous. 3 stories tall with over 20 rooms. It sat on 10 acres of private land surrounded by tall trees and iron gates. Security cameras covered every angle. Guards patrolled the property. It was a fortress. Inside, the atmosphere was cold. The furniture was expensive but uncomfortable. The walls were white and bare. There were no family photos. No children's drawings on the fridge. No toys scattered on the floor. Everything was clean, organized, and silent. Oliver lived on the 2nd floor in a large bedroom at the end of the hallway. His room had a bed, a desk, a bookshelf, and a window that overlooked the back garden. The walls were painted light blue. There was a television, but it was rarely on. Oliver spent most of his time sitting on the floor or staring out the window. He didn't play. He didn't read. He just existed. Thomas rarely spent time with him. He was always busy with meetings, phone calls, and public appearances. When he did come home, he went straight to his office or his bedroom. He didn't talk to Oliver. He didn't sit with him. He treated the boy like a responsibility, not a son. The only person who truly cared for Oliver was Grace. She had been the Garrett family's housemaid for over 10 years. She started working there before Oliver was born. She cooked the meals, cleaned the rooms, and took care of the daily needs of the household. But over time, her role became much more. She became Oliver's caregiver. She fed him. She bathed him. She dressed him. She sat with him when he was alone. Grace was in her late 50s. She had gray hair tied back in a bun and kind eyes that always seemed worried. She didn't talk much, but she was always watching. She noticed everything. Grace had raised Oliver from infancy. She remembered when he was a baby, how he used to make small sounds. Coos and gurgles like any other infant. She remembered him turning his head toward her voice. She remembered him reaching for her when she entered the room. But as he grew older, those responses stopped. By the time he was 3, Oliver no longer reacted to sound. He no longer made noise. Thomas said it was the progression of his condition. Grace had always wondered if that was true. She never said anything. She wasn't a doctor. She had no proof. But something inside her felt wrong about the whole situation. Over the years, Grace watched Thomas closely. She saw how he controlled everything about Oliver's life. The boy's schedule, his meals, his activities. Thomas insisted on giving Oliver his medication personally. Every morning, without fail, Thomas came into Oliver's room with a small brown bottle. He poured liquid into a spoon and made Oliver swallow it. He said it was medicine to keep Oliver's neurological condition stable. Grace was never allowed to give the medicine. Thomas said it had to be administered at precise times and doses. Only he could do it. Grace found that strange. Why wouldn't he let the nurse handle it? Why was he so protective of that bottle? She also noticed that Thomas and Monica had private meetings in his office late at night. The door was always closed. Sometimes their voices were raised. Grace couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clear. They were arguing, planning, strategizing. It didn't sound like conversations about helping a sick child. It sounded like business. Grace began to feel uneasy. She tried to push the feelings away. She told herself she was imagining things. Thomas was a public figure. He was fighting for his son. Why would she doubt him? But the unease remained. One evening, Grace was cleaning the hallway outside Thomas's office. The door was slightly open. She could hear Thomas and Monica talking inside. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their voices were clear. Monica said something about the timeline. She said they needed to keep the public engaged. Thomas responded, saying the court was stalling. He sounded frustrated. Then Monica said something that made Grace stop moving. We just need to hold the story together until the funds are released. After that, none of this matters. Grace's heart beat faster. What did that mean? Hold the story together? She stood still, listening. Thomas replied, "The kid is the key. As long as he stays silent, no one can question us." Grace felt cold. She stepped away from the door quietly and went back to the kitchen. She didn't know what to think. Was she misunderstanding? Or was something terrible happening? She wanted to ask someone, but who? She was just a housemaid. Who would believe her over Thomas Garrett? That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in her small room at the back of the house, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Oliver, the quiet boy who never smiled, the child who flinched when his father entered the room, the son who seemed more like a prisoner than a patient. Grace made a decision. She would pay closer attention. She would watch. She would listen. And if something was truly wrong, she would find a way to help Oliver, even if it meant risking everything. Thomas continued his public campaign with even more intensity. He appeared on a nationally televised interview with one of the country's most popular hosts. The host asked him emotional questions. How does it feel to watch your son suffer? What keeps you going? Thomas answered with practiced precision. He spoke slowly, pausing at the right moments. He wiped his eyes once, though Grace, watching from the mansion, didn't see any actual tears. The host praised him. The audience applauded. Social media exploded with support again. Donations increased. Pressure on the court grew stronger. Politicians began making statements. Some called for emergency legislation to release the funds. Others demanded the oversight committee step aside. The story became a national debate. Legal experts appeared on news programs arguing both sides. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on Thomas's side. How could anyone deny a sick child the chance to hear and speak? Monica used the momentum. She filed another motion, this time citing public interest and humanitarian grounds. She argued that the court had a moral obligation to act. She brought in more expert witnesses. She presented new medical reports. She made it clear that every day of delay was a day stolen from Oliver's future. The judge, under immense pressure, agreed to hold a special hearing. The date was set. 3 weeks away. Monica told the press that this hearing would be the final push. She said they would present the confidential document that proved Oliver's eligibility beyond any doubt. She said the court would have no choice but to release the funds. Thomas stood beside her during the press conference. He thanked everyone for their support. He said he could finally see hope on the horizon. He asked people to keep praying for Oliver. The cameras captured it all. But back at the mansion, Grace was becoming more suspicious. She had started keeping a small notebook. In it, she wrote down things she observed. Times when Thomas gave Oliver the medicine. Conversations she overheard. Moments when Oliver seemed afraid. She didn't know what she would do with the notes. She just felt the need to document what she saw. One afternoon, Monica left a folder on the kitchen counter. Grace was washing dishes and noticed it. The folder was labeled Medical Records, Oliver Garrett. Grace hesitated. She knew she shouldn't look. But something pushed her. She dried her hands and opened the folder. Inside were pages of documents. Lab results. Doctor's notes. Prescription details. Grace didn't understand most of it. But one thing stood out. Several of the doctor's signatures looked identical. Too identical. Like they had been copied. Grace's hands trembled. She quickly took out her phone and snapped pictures of a few pages. Then she closed the folder and placed it back exactly where it was. She finished the dishes and left the kitchen, her mind racing. She didn't know what the documents meant. But she knew something was wrong. She thought about showing someone, but who? The police? They would never believe her without more proof. A lawyer? She couldn't afford one. A reporter? That felt too dangerous. So she did nothing. She just kept watching. Kept waiting. Kept hoping that somehow the truth would come out before it was too late. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed more confident than ever. He walked through the house with a sense of purpose. He made phone calls with a smile on his face. He told Monica that everything was going according to plan. Grace heard him say those exact words one night. Everything is going according to plan. She shivered. Plan? And what role did Oliver play in it? The boy, as always, stayed silent. He sat in his room, staring at nothing. He ate when food was brought to him. He went to bed when told. He never resisted. Never questioned. Never spoke. But Grace noticed something new. Oliver had started watching people more closely. His eyes followed Thomas when he entered the room. He stared at Monica when she walked past. He looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear. It wasn't sadness. It was something else. Awareness. Like he was seeing things he hadn't noticed before. Grace wondered if Oliver understood more than anyone realized. She wondered if, behind that silence, there was a mind that knew exactly what was happening. The thought gave her chills. Because if Oliver knew the truth and couldn't speak it, then he was trapped in the worst kind of prison. A prison built by his own father. The morning of the hearing arrived with tension thick enough to cut. Thomas Garrett woke up early, dressed in his most expensive suit, and prepared himself for what he called the most important day of his life. Monica Pierce had already been at the courthouse for an hour, setting up documents and coordinating with her legal team. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras ready, waiting for the moment that would decide Oliver's fate. Grace woke up that morning with a heavy feeling in her chest. She had barely slept. All night, she kept thinking about the medical records she had photographed, the strange conversations she had overheard, and the way Oliver looked at his father with something that resembled fear more than love. She got dressed and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She expected Thomas to leave early, but he was already in the dining room, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low but sharp. Grace couldn't make out all the words, but she heard enough. "It has to be today," Thomas said. "No mistakes. Everything depends on this." He ended the call and noticed Grace standing in the doorway. For a moment, their eyes met. Thomas's expression was unreadable. Then he walked past her without a word and headed upstairs. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. An hour later, Thomas came back downstairs carrying a leather briefcase. He looked composed, confident even. Monica had arrived at the house to pick him up. She was dressed sharply in a black suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She greeted Thomas with a nod but said nothing. The two of them moved with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment many times. Grace stood near the hallway watching them. She wanted to say something, to ask what was really going on, but the words stayed trapped in her throat. Who was she to question a billionaire and his high-powered lawyer? Thomas turned to her before leaving. Grace, make sure Oliver eats his breakfast. I'll be back later this afternoon. Don't let anyone in the house. No visitors. No calls. Understood? Grace nodded. Yes, sir. Thomas and Monica left. The front door closed with a heavy thud. The house fell silent. Grace stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of that silence pressing down on her. Then she went upstairs to check on Oliver. The boy was sitting on his bed, staring out the window. He didn't turn when she entered. Grace approached slowly and sat down beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, being present. After a while, she reached out and gently touched his hand. Oliver didn't pull away. Grace whispered, even though she believed he couldn't hear her, I don't know what's happening, but I promise I'll protect you. Oliver's eyes shifted slightly, looking at her for just a second before returning to the window. Grace wished she could know what he was thinking. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. News vans filled the parking lot. Journalists jostled for position. Thomas and Monica walked through the crowd with their heads held high. Microphones were shoved in their faces. Questions were shouted from every direction. Mr. Garrett, how confident are you today? Monica, do you think the judge will rule in your favor? Is Oliver going to get the treatment he needs? Monica answered with practiced ease. We are very confident. We have presented overwhelming evidence. Today, justice will finally be served for Oliver Garrett. Thomas added, all I want is for my son to have a chance at a normal life. That's all any parent would want. The crowd cheered. People held signs that read, Justice for Oliver, and Release the funds. It felt like a movement. Inside the courtroom, the judge took his seat. The gallery was packed. Lawyers from the Oversight Committee sat on one side, stiff and serious. Monica and her team sat on the other, organized and ready. The judge called the session to order and asked Monica to present her case. Monica stood confidently. She began with a passionate opening statement, reiterating the urgency of Oliver's situation. She spoke about the narrow medical window, the groundbreaking therapy, and the cruel delay caused by bureaucratic red tape. She held up a folder and said, Your Honor, this document contains the final piece of evidence required to release the research funds. It is a certified medical evaluation proving Oliver Garrett's eligibility under the funds criteria. This document has been verified by independent specialists and meets every legal standard. The judge asked to see the document. Monica turned to Thomas, who was sitting behind her. She extended her hand expectantly. Thomas reached into his briefcase. His hand froze. His face went pale. He searched through the briefcase frantically, pulling out papers, files, folders. His movements became more frantic. Monica's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. Thomas, she said quietly. Thomas looked up, his face drained of color. It's not here. The courtroom went silent. The judge leaned forward. Excuse me? Thomas stood up, his voice shaking. The document. It's gone. It was in my office last night. I locked it in my safe. But this morning, it's not there. Murmurs spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Reporters in the back started whispering urgently into their phones. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Mr. Garrett, are you saying the document has been lost? Thomas shook his head, his voice rising. Not lost. Stolen. Someone took it from my home. Monica looked stunned. She turned to Thomas, her voice low but sharp. What are you talking about? Thomas addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, I need to report a theft. Last night, the confidential document was secured in my office safe. This morning it was gone. The safe was opened, but there was no sign of forced entry. Only a few people have access to my home. I believe it was taken by someone inside. The judge looked skeptical. This is a very serious accusation, Mr. Garrett. Do you have any evidence? Thomas hesitated. Then he said, I believe it was my housemaid, Grace Whitman. The courtroom erupted. People gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. Monica's eyes widened. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in the court. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. Grace has worked for my family for many years. But recently, she has been acting strangely. She has been asking questions, going through my office, and behaving in ways that made me uncomfortable. I believe she took the document out of spite or for personal gain." Monica, recovering from her shock, added, "Your Honor, I can confirm that Grace Whitman has had access to Mr. Garrett's office. She has also been present during private conversations and has shown signs of resentment toward our legal efforts." The judge looked serious. "This is a criminal matter. I will have to involve law enforcement. In the meantime, this hearing is suspended until the document is recovered or replaced." He banged the gavel. The session was over. Outside the courtroom, Thomas was swarmed by reporters. He repeated his accusation. He said he trusted Grace for years, but she had betrayed that trust. He said he didn't know why she would do such a thing, but he was determined to find out. Monica stood beside him, adding that they would cooperate fully with the police investigation. The story exploded across the news. Within hours, Grace's name and face were everywhere. Photos of her were pulled from social media. Reporters camped outside the Garrett mansion. The narrative was clear. A trusted housemaid had sabotaged a desperate father's attempt to save his son. Public opinion turned quickly. People who had supported Thomas now directed their anger at Grace. Online comments were brutal. How could she do this to a sick child? She should be in prison. Evil woman. Grace had no idea what was happening. She was still at the mansion, cleaning up after breakfast, when police cars pulled into the driveway. Officers knocked on the door. Grace opened it, confused. "Grace Whitman?" one officer asked. "Yes. You're being questioned in connection with the theft of a confidential legal document. Please come with us." Grace's heart dropped. "I don't understand. I didn't take anything." The officers were polite but firm. They explained that Thomas had filed a report and they needed to bring her in for questioning. Grace's hands trembled as she grabbed her coat. She looked back at the house, at Oliver's window on the second floor. The boy was standing there, watching. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Then the officers led her away. At the police station, Grace was placed in a small interrogation room. Detectives came in and asked her questions. "Where were you last night? Do you have access to Mr. Garrett's office? Have you ever handled confidential documents?" Grace answered truthfully. Yes, she cleaned the office. Yes, she had been in there many times. But no, she had never taken anything. She didn't even know what document they were talking about. The detectives showed her photos of the safe in Thomas's office. They asked if she knew the combination. Grace said she didn't. They asked if she had ever seen Thomas open it. She said no. They pressed harder. "Did you have a grudge against Mr. Garrett? Were you angry about something? Did someone offer you money to take the document?" Grace's voice broke. "I would never hurt Oliver. I've raised that boy since he was a baby. I love him like my own son. I didn't take anything." The detectives exchanged looks. One of them said, "Mr. Garrett claims you've been acting suspiciously. He says you've been resentful of his legal efforts." Grace shook her head. "That's not true. I've been worried about Oliver, yes. But I would never do anything to harm him or his father." The questioning went on for hours. Grace was exhausted, scared, and confused. She didn't understand why Thomas would accuse her. What did he have to gain by blaming her? Finally, the detectives let her go. They said they didn't have enough evidence to charge her yet, but she was not allowed to return to the Garrett mansion. She was told to stay away from Thomas and Oliver until the investigation was complete. Grace left the station feeling broken. She had nowhere to go. Her small apartment had been given up years ago when she moved into the mansion full-time. She called a friend and asked if she could stay for a few days. The friend hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually agreed. That night, Grace sat in her friend's guest room, staring at the wall. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages. Some were from people she barely knew, calling her terrible names. Others were from reporters asking for her side of the story. She turned off her phone and cried. She didn't cry for herself. She cried for Oliver, the boy who had no one else. The boy who was now completely alone with a father who was hiding something terrible. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Thomas sat in his office with Monica. The door was closed. Monica paced back and forth, her voice low but sharp. "You didn't tell me you were going to do this." Thomas leaned back in his chair, calm. "It had to be done. We needed more time, and we needed a scapegoat." Monica stopped pacing. "A scapegoat? You just destroyed that woman's life." Thomas shrugged. "She's a housemaid. No one will remember her name in a week. What matters is that we've bought ourselves time. The court will delay the hearing. The investigation will take weeks, maybe months. And in that time, we can figure out our next move." Monica stared at him. "And what if they find out the truth?" Thomas's expression hardened. "They won't. As long as Oliver stays silent, no one can prove anything." Monica said nothing. She looked uneasy, but she didn't argue. She had come too far to back out now. Upstairs, Oliver sat alone in his room. The house felt emptier without Grace. She was the only person who had ever been kind to him. The only person who treated him like a person, not a pawn. Now she was gone. And he didn't know why. Oliver lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the medicine his father gave him every morning. He thought about the way his father's voice sounded when he spoke to Monica. He thought about Grace's face the last time he saw her, framed in his window as the police took her away. Something inside Oliver shifted. For the first time in his life, he felt anger. Not sadness. Not fear. Anger. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing clearly. His father was lying. And Grace was paying the price for it. Oliver made a decision that night. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way to help her. Even if it meant breaking his silence. Even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, Thomas came into Oliver's room with the brown bottle as usual. He poured the liquid into the spoon and held it out. "Open up," he said. Oliver looked at the spoon. Then he looked at his father. For the first time, he didn't open his mouth right away. Thomas frowned. "Oliver, take your medicine." Oliver stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he opened his mouth. Thomas gave him the liquid. Oliver swallowed. But as soon as his father left the room, Oliver went to the bathroom. He leaned over the sink and spit out as much of the medicine as he could. He rinsed his mouth with water again and again. Then he looked at himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him. A boy who had been silent his entire life. But not anymore. Not for much longer. The days after Grace's removal from the mansion felt like living in a tomb. The house had always been quiet, but now the silence was suffocating. There were no warm meals waiting on the table. No gentle voice asking if Oliver needed anything. No soft footsteps in the hallway checking on him throughout the day. Grace was gone, and with her absence, the last bit of warmth in that cold house disappeared. Thomas hired a temporary housemaid named Ruth. She was in her 40s, efficient and cold. She cooked basic meals, cleaned the necessary rooms, and left Oliver alone. She never spoke to him. Never looked at him for more than a second. To her, Oliver was just another piece of furniture in the house. Something to work around, not with. Oliver felt the difference immediately. Ruth brought his meals on a tray and set them on his desk without a word. She picked up his laundry without asking if he needed anything. She moved through his room like a robot programmed to complete tasks. There was no kindness. No connection. Just routine. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed more focused than ever. He spent hours on the phone with Monica, strategizing their next steps. The police investigation into the missing document was ongoing, but progress was slow. No evidence had been found linking Grace to the theft. The media coverage continued, but the initial frenzy was dying down. People were starting to ask questions. If Grace didn't take the document, then who did? Some online commentators began to wonder if the document ever existed at all. Thomas knew he needed to maintain the narrative. He did another round of interviews, appearing on podcasts and news programs. He spoke about the emotional toll of the theft, how it had devastated him to think someone he trusted could betray his family. He painted Grace as a troubled woman who had grown jealous of the attention his case was receiving. He said he had no ill will toward her, but justice needed to be served. Every morning, without fail, Thomas entered Oliver's room at exactly 7 o'clock. He carried the same brown bottle, the same silver spoon. The ritual never changed. Thomas would unscrew the cap, pour the thick liquid carefully, and hold the spoon out to Oliver. "Open," he would say. Not, "Good morning." Not, "How did you sleep?" Just, "Open." Oliver had been taking this medicine for as long as he could remember. When he was younger, maybe 4 or 5, he used to cry when his father brought the bottle. The liquid tasted bitter and made his stomach feel strange. But Thomas was never gentle about it. If Oliver resisted, Thomas would grab his jaw and force his mouth open. After a few years, Oliver stopped resisting. It was easier to just swallow and get it over with. Thomas always watched him closely, making sure the liquid went down. Then he would leave without another word. For years, Oliver believed what his father told him. The medicine was necessary. It kept his condition stable. Without it, things would get worse. But lately, Oliver had been thinking. What condition exactly? His father said he was deaf and unable to speak because of a neurological disorder. But Oliver had never felt anything wrong with his throat. He had never felt pain in his ears. He just was silent. He didn't remember ever trying to speak and failing. He didn't remember sounds fading away. He just existed in silence because that was all he had ever known. Or was it? Sometimes, late at night, Oliver had strange dreams. In those dreams, he heard things. Distant voices. Music. Laughter. He always woke up thinking they were just dreams, products of imagination. But what if they weren't? What if, somewhere deep in his memory, he remembered a time when he could hear? The thought scared him. If that were true, it would mean his father had been lying to him his entire life. But why would a father lie about something like that? What could he possibly gain? Oliver didn't have answers. But he was starting to have doubts. And those doubts grew stronger every day. One morning, after Thomas left the room with the brown bottle, Oliver sat on his bed thinking. He looked at the door his father had just walked through. Then he looked at his hands. He thought about Grace. He thought about how she used to sit with him, how she would smile even when he didn't smile back. He thought about the way his father never looked at him with warmth, only with control. Oliver made a decision. He didn't fully understand why, but something inside him said it was time to stop obeying blindly. The next morning, when Thomas came in with the medicine, Oliver opened his mouth as usual. Thomas poured the liquid onto the spoon and held it out. Oliver took it into his mouth. Thomas watched for a moment, then nodded and left the room. As soon as the door closed, Oliver got up quickly. He walked to the bathroom, leaned over the sink, and spit out the liquid. It was thick and sticky, clinging to his tongue. He turned on the faucet and rinsed his mouth over and over again until the taste was mostly gone. His heart pounded. He felt like he had just done something dangerous, something forbidden. But he also felt a strange sense of power. For the first time in his life, he had made a choice. He had said no, even if it was silent. Oliver returned to his bed and sat down. He waited. He didn't know what to expect. Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe he would feel the same as always. But as the hours passed, something did change. It was subtle at first. A strange sensation in his head, like pressure releasing. The fog that usually settled over his thoughts after taking the medicine didn't come. His mind felt clearer, sharper. By the afternoon, Oliver noticed something else. He felt more awake, more aware. The drowsiness that normally followed the medicine was absent. He looked around his room and everything seemed brighter, more defined. That night, Oliver lay in bed feeling different. Not sick. Not weak. Just awake. He stared at the ceiling, wondering if he had imagined it. But deep down he knew. The medicine was doing something to him. Something bad. The next morning, Thomas came in again with the bottle. Oliver's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. He opened his mouth. Took the liquid. Waited for his father to leave. Then he spit it out again. This time, he felt even more certain. He was doing the right thing. Days passed. Every morning, Oliver repeated the same process. Take the medicine. Spit it out. Rinse. Hide the evidence. Thomas never suspected anything. He believed Oliver was still obediently swallowing the liquid. Why wouldn't he? Oliver had been doing it for 12 years without question. As the medicine left his system, Oliver began to notice more changes. His energy increased. The constant heaviness in his limbs faded. His thoughts became clearer, faster. He started noticing details he had never paid attention to before. The way light moved across the walls. The patterns in the carpet. The expression on Ruth's face when she brought his meals. But the most shocking change came about a week after he stopped taking the medicine. Oliver was sitting on his bed one afternoon when he heard something. At first, he thought he was imagining it. A faint sound, distant and muffled, like something far away. He sat very still, barely breathing. There it was again. A low hum. He couldn't tell where it was coming from. He looked around the room, trying to locate the source. The sound continued, steady and constant. It took him several minutes to realize what it was. The air conditioning. He was hearing the air conditioning. Oliver's hands began to shake. He pressed his palms against his ears, then pulled them away. The sound was still there, faint but real. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he saw a bird land on a tree branch. Its beak opened and closed. And Oliver heard it. A soft chirp. Quiet, but unmistakable. His legs gave out. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, staring at nothing. He could hear. He could actually hear. Tears filled his eyes. Not tears of joy. Tears of confusion, fear, and anger. If he could hear now, that meant he had been able to hear before. The medicine had been stopping him. His father had been stopping him. For what? What possible reason could there be? Oliver didn't leave his room for the rest of the day. He sat on the floor, processing what had just happened. Every small sound felt like a revelation. The creak of the floorboards. The wind against the window. The distant hum of a car passing outside the gates. Sounds he had never experienced before, or at least never remembered experiencing. That night, Oliver couldn't sleep. His mind raced with questions. How long had his father been doing this? Since birth? Since he was a toddler? And the bigger question, why? The next morning, Thomas came in with the medicine as usual. But this time, Oliver looked at him differently. He studied his father's face. The way his mouth moved. The way his eyes stayed cold and detached. Thomas held out the spoon. Open. Oliver opened his mouth. But this time, he heard his father's voice. It was deep, firm, and completely devoid of warmth. Oliver took the liquid and Thomas left. Oliver spit it out immediately, but this time he stood in front of the mirror afterward. He stared at his reflection and whispered, "Hello." The sound that came out was rough, unfamiliar. His vocal cords weren't used to working. But it was a sound. A word. His word. Oliver covered his mouth with his hand, shocked. He tried again. "Hello." This time it was a little clearer. He tried other words. Grace. Father. Help. Each one felt strange, but possible. He could speak. He had always been able to speak. The medicine had kept him silent. Oliver sat on the edge of his bed, his mind reeling. Everything he had believed about himself was a lie. He wasn't disabled. He wasn't broken. He had been drugged. Intentionally. By his own father. Over the next few days, Oliver's hearing continued to improve. The sounds grew clearer, sharper. He began to distinguish between different noises. Footsteps in the hallway. Thomas's voice on the phone downstairs. Ruth moving through the kitchen. And one night he heard something that changed everything. It was late. Oliver was lying in bed, the lights off, when he heard voices. They were coming from downstairs, but they were loud enough to reach his room. He sat up and listened carefully. It was Thomas and Monica. They were arguing. Monica's voice was sharp. "We can't keep stalling. The court is losing patience. If we don't produce that document soon, they're going to start asking real questions." Thomas responded, his voice calm but cold. "The document doesn't matter. It never did. The whole point was to keep the story alive long enough to unlock the fund. Once we have access to the money, the rest doesn't matter." Monica's voice rose. "And what about the boy? What happens when people start wondering why he's not getting better?" Thomas laughed. It was a short, humorless sound. "Oliver isn't going to get better, Monica. That's the point. As long as he stays silent, no one can question the story. The medicine makes sure of that." Oliver's blood ran cold. He pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear more. Monica continued, You've been giving him that sedative for 12 years. What if someone finds out? What if a doctor examines him and realizes, Thomas cut her off? No one will find out. I control who sees him. I control his medical records. And I control the narrative. Oliver is the perfect victim. Silent, sympathetic, and completely under my control. Monica sighed. This is getting too risky, Thomas. We've already framed the housemaid. If this falls apart, it won't fall apart, Thomas said firmly. Grace has no proof. The investigation will go nowhere. And in a few weeks, the court will release the funds to avoid more bad press. We'll take the money, disappear quietly, and live very comfortably for the rest of our lives. Oliver will stay silent, just like he always has. There was a pause. Then Monica said quietly, and what about Oliver? What happens to him after we take the money? Thomas's response was cold. He'll be fine. I'll put him in a care facility somewhere. He'll be looked after. It's not like he'll know the difference. Oliver stepped back from the door. His entire body was shaking. His father wasn't trying to save him. His father was using him. The therapy, the research fund, the public campaign, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed scam to steal millions of dollars. And Oliver was the key. As long as he stayed silent and helpless, no one would question the story. The medicine wasn't treating a condition. It was creating one. It was keeping him deaf and mute so his father could exploit him. Oliver sat on the floor, his back against the wall, tears streaming down his face. He thought about Grace. She had been telling the truth. She hadn't stolen anything. His father had framed her to buy more time, to keep the scam going. And now she was suffering because of it. Oliver clenched his fists. He felt anger like he had never felt before. His entire life had been stolen from him. 12 years of silence. 12 years of isolation. All because his father valued money more than his own son. But now Oliver knew the truth. And he had something his father didn't know he had. A voice. Oliver stood up and walked to his closet. He reached behind a stack of old books and pulled out a small plastic device. It was a voice recorder he had found in a box of old toys weeks ago. He had been playing with it, testing it, seeing if it still worked. It did. Oliver turned it on. The small red light blinked. He placed it carefully on the floor near the heating vent. Sound traveled through the vents in this old house. He had learned that over the past few days, if Thomas and Monica talked downstairs again, the recorder would pick it up. Oliver didn't know what he would do with the recording yet. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The next morning, Thomas came in with the medicine. Oliver looked at him with new eyes. He saw his father not as a protector, but as a predator. Thomas held out the spoon. Open. Oliver opened his mouth. He took the liquid. Thomas watched for a moment, then left. Oliver walked to the bathroom and spit it out, just like every other day. But this time, as he rinsed his mouth, he looked at himself in the mirror and whispered, soon. His voice was still rough, still unpracticed. But it was there. And soon, the world would hear it. Thomas had no idea that the silent boy he had controlled for 12 years was about to become his greatest threat. Oliver didn't have a full plan yet. He didn't know exactly how he would expose the truth. But he knew that Grace was innocent. He knew that his father was a liar. And he knew that the time for silence was over. For the first time in his life, Oliver felt something he had never felt before. Not hope that someone would save him, but hope that he could save himself. And that hope, small as it was, gave him the strength to keep going. The recording device stayed hidden near the vent. Every night, Oliver checked it. Sometimes there were conversations. Sometimes there was nothing. But he kept it running, kept it recording, kept gathering evidence. Because Oliver understood something now. His father had power, money, influence. But Oliver had something stronger. The truth. And the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Oliver sat on his bed that night, listening to the sounds of the house. The creak of the stairs. The hum of the refrigerator. The distant murmur of voices. Sounds that had been stolen from him for so long. And he smiled. A small, quiet smile. Because he knew something his father didn't. The silent boy was silent no more. Oliver's world had transformed in the span of 2 weeks. What had once been absolute silence was now filled with a symphony of sounds he was still learning to identify. Every creak, every whisper, every distant noise was a discovery. But with each new sound came a deeper understanding of just how much had been stolen from him. He wasn't just learning to hear. He was learning to understand the prison he had been living in his entire life. The medicine bottle sat on his father's desk downstairs, a small brown container that held 12 years of lies. Oliver thought about it constantly. He wondered what exactly was in that liquid. What drug could suppress hearing and speech so completely? What kind of person would do this to their own child? The answers made him sick, but he needed to know more. He needed evidence that couldn't be denied. Oliver had become an expert at pretending. Every morning when Thomas entered his room, Oliver played the role perfectly. The silent, obedient son. He kept his face blank, his eyes unfocused. He opened his mouth when told. He swallowed when watched. And the moment his father left, he purged the poison from his system. It had become routine. But the acting was getting harder. Now that Oliver could hear his father's voice, he heard the coldness in it, the lack of love, the mechanical efficiency of a man going through motions without any real care. Every word Thomas spoke was calculated, controlled. There was never a good morning, or, how are you feeling? Just commands. Instructions. Control. One morning, after Thomas left with the medicine bottle, Oliver waited 5 minutes to make sure his father was gone. Then he quietly opened his bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. His heart pounded. He had never disobeyed like this before. He had always stayed in his room unless someone came to get him. But things were different now. He needed to know more. The house was large, and Oliver had only ever seen a fraction of it. He knew his room, the bathroom, and the route to the dining room. That was it. Now, he moved carefully down the hallway, his bare feet silent on the carpet. He passed closed doors, guest rooms that were never used. He reached the staircase and paused, listening. Downstairs, he could hear Ruth in the kitchen. The sound of running water. Dishes clinking. Thomas was in his office with the door closed. Oliver could hear his father's muffled voice through the walls, probably on another phone call with Monica. Oliver descended the stairs slowly, keeping to the side where the steps didn't creak. He had learned which boards made noise by listening over the past few days. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned left toward Thomas's office. The door was closed, but not locked. Oliver pressed his ear against it and listened. Thomas was speaking. No, we can't rush this. The investigation is still active. If we push too hard, it'll look suspicious. There was a pause. Monica must have been responding on the other end. Thomas continued, Grace is not a problem. She has no credibility. No one believes her. And even if she tries to speak out, we'll bury her story. I have lawyers for that. Another pause. Oliver? He's fine. Completely compliant. The medicine is working exactly as it should. He doesn't suspect anything. Oliver's jaw tightened. He wanted to burst through that door and scream the truth. But he couldn't. Not yet. He didn't have enough proof. It would be his word against his father's, and who would believe a boy who had been silent his entire life? Oliver moved away from the office door and walked quietly toward the kitchen. He peered around the corner. Ruth had her back to him, washing dishes with headphones in her ears. She was listening to music, completely unaware of his presence. Oliver slipped past the kitchen entrance and continued down another hallway. He didn't know where he was going. He was exploring, looking for anything that might help him. He passed a sitting room, a library filled with books that had never been read, and a formal dining room that was never used. Everything in this house was for show. Nothing was real. At the end of the hallway, Oliver found a door that was slightly open. He pushed it gently and it swung inward. It was Thomas's study, different from his main office. This room was smaller, more private. The walls were lined with filing cabinets. A desk sat in the center with a computer and stacks of papers. Oliver stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind him. He looked around, his heart racing. He didn't have much time. Ruth could finish in the kitchen any minute. Thomas could come out of his office. He needed to be fast. Oliver approached the desk and looked at the papers. Most of them were financial documents, bank statements, investment reports, legal contracts. Oliver couldn't understand most of it, but he took photos with an old camera he had found in his room weeks ago. Grace had given it to him years ago, a simple point-and-shoot that still worked. He had been taking pictures of his room, of the garden outside his window. Now, he used it to document evidence. He photographed everything on the desk. Then he moved to the filing cabinets. The first two were locked, but the third opened. Inside were folders labeled with names and dates. Oliver pulled out a few and flipped through them. His hands stopped when he found a folder labeled Medical Records, Oliver Garrett. He opened it. Inside were documents that made his stomach turn. Prescription records dating back 12 years. The same medication, refilled every month without fail. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note clipped to one of the pages. It read, "Patient shows no signs of neurological disorder. Hearing and speech capabilities normal. Sedative suppression effective. Continue current dosage." Oliver's hands shook. This was it. Proof. Written proof that his father knew. That there was no disorder. That the medicine was intentionally suppressing his abilities. He took several photos of the document, making sure every word was clear. Then he carefully placed the folder back exactly where he found it and closed the cabinet. He turned to leave, but froze when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was coming. Oliver's mind raced. There was no other exit. The window was too high and too small. He looked around frantically and spotted a large curtain in the corner that covered a storage alcove. He dove behind it just as the door opened. Thomas entered the study. Oliver held his breath, pressing himself against the wall behind the curtain. His heart pounded so loud he was sure his father could hear it. Thomas walked to the desk and picked up a folder. He flipped through it briefly, then made a phone call. "Monica, I'm looking at the financial projections. Once the funds are released, we'll need to move quickly. Transfer everything offshore within 48 hours. I don't want any trail leading back to us." Oliver listened, his body tense. Thomas continued, "And make sure the story stays consistent. Oliver remains the sympathetic victim. We can't afford any slip-ups now. We're too close." Thomas ended the call and left the room, closing the door behind him. Oliver waited a full minute before emerging from behind the curtain. His legs were shaking. That was too close. He left the study quickly and made his way back upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. When he reached his room, he closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. He had done it. He had evidence. Real, documented proof of what his father was doing. But he still needed more. He needed a plan. That night, Oliver couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything he had learned. The medical records. The phone conversations. The lies. His father had built an entire empire of deception, and Oliver had been the foundation. But now the foundation was cracking. Oliver thought about Grace. She was out there somewhere, her life destroyed by a lie. She had been accused of a crime she didn't commit. She had lost her job, her home, her reputation. All because Thomas needed a scapegoat. Oliver felt a deep sense of guilt. If he had been able to speak earlier, if he had known sooner, maybe he could have stopped this. But he had been trapped in silence, a prisoner in his own body. Not anymore. Oliver got out of bed and walked to his closet. He pulled out the voice recorder from its hiding spot. He had been recording conversations for over a week now. He pressed play and listened to the fragments he had captured. Thomas and Monica discussing the fund. Thomas mentioning the medicine. Monica expressing concerns about getting caught. It was all there. Pieces of a confession scattered across multiple recordings. But Oliver knew it wasn't enough. Courts needed clear, undeniable evidence. He needed his father to say something explicit. Something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Over the next few days, Oliver became bolder. He started leaving his room more often, always when he knew Thomas was occupied. He explored more of the house, learning its layout, finding the best places to hide if he needed to. He also started testing his voice in private. Every night, after everyone was asleep, he would whisper words to himself. His voice was getting stronger, clearer. The roughness was fading. He practiced forming sentences, speaking full thoughts. My name is Oliver Garrett. My father has been lying. I can hear. I can speak. Each sentence felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that had been stolen. One afternoon, Oliver overheard Ruth on the phone in the kitchen. She was talking to someone, probably a friend, complaining about her job. It's the weirdest house I've ever worked in, she said. The kid never makes a sound. Just sits there like a doll. And the father? Cold as ice. He doesn't even look at the boy like he's his son. More like, I don't know, like he's a possession or something. Oliver stood in the hallway, listening. Even Ruth, who barely paid attention, could see that something was wrong. That gave him a strange sense of validation. He wasn't imagining things. The situation was as bad as he thought. That evening, Thomas and Monica had another meeting in the office. Oliver positioned his recorder near the vent in his room and listened through the floor. Their voices were clear. Monica sounded stressed. The court is scheduling another hearing in 2 weeks. They want to resolve this. If we don't have that document, they're going to dismiss the case entirely. Thomas replied calmly, then we'll provide a document. What do you mean? I mean we'll create one. I have contacts. People who can forge medical certifications that will pass any inspection. It'll cost money, but we'll get it back tenfold once the funds are released. Monica hesitated. That's fraud, Thomas. Serious fraud. If we get caught, we won't get caught, Thomas interrupted. Everyone is already on our side. The public, the media, even some of the judges. They want to believe the story. We're just giving them what they want. There was a long pause. Then Monica said quietly, and after? When we have the money? Thomas's voice was cold. We disappear. New identities, offshore accounts, a quiet life somewhere warm. Oliver will be placed in a private facility under a different name. No one will ever connect us to this. Oliver's hands clenched into fists. His father was planning to abandon him. After using him for 12 years, after stealing his voice and his life, Thomas was going to dump him in some facility and disappear with the money. The rage Oliver felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. But beneath the rage was something stronger. Determination. He was not going to let this happen. Not to himself. And not to Grace. The next morning, Oliver made a decision. He couldn't wait any longer. The hearing was in 2 weeks. If his father presented a forged document and the court released the funds, it would be over. Thomas and Monica would take the money and vanish, and Oliver would be left with nothing. He needed to act now. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He needed someone who would believe him, someone who had a reason to want the truth exposed. He needed Grace. Oliver knew Grace had been banned from contacting the family, but he also knew she cared about him. If he could find a way to reach her, if he could tell her what he knew, maybe together they could stop this. The problem was, Oliver had no way to contact her. He didn't have a phone. He didn't know where she was staying. He was still a prisoner in this house, just a more aware one. He sat on his bed, thinking hard. Then an idea came to him. Ruth might not care about him, but she wasn't part of the conspiracy. She was just a temporary worker. If Oliver could get her attention, if he could show her something that proved he wasn't what everyone thought he was, maybe she would help. It was risky. If Ruth told Thomas, everything would be over. But Oliver was running out of options. That afternoon, while Ruth was cleaning his room, Oliver did something he had never done before. He stood up and walked directly toward her. Ruth glanced at him, mildly surprised. Oliver usually just sat quietly and ignored her. Oliver reached out and gently touched her arm. Ruth jumped, startled. She pulled out one of her earbuds. What? You need something? Oliver looked at her directly. Then, for the first time in 12 years, he spoke out loud to another person. His voice was quiet, rough from lack of use, but clear. Help me. Ruth's face went pale. Her eyes widened in shock. The cleaning cloth slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. She stared at Oliver like she had just seen a ghost. You just... Ruth couldn't finish the sentence. Oliver spoke again, his voice stronger this time. Please, help me. Ruth took a step back, her hand over her mouth. You can talk. You can actually talk. Oliver nodded. I've always been able to. My father has been lying. Ruth looked at the door, then back at Oliver. Her face was a mixture of confusion, fear, and disbelief. This is insane. I need to tell Mr. Garrett. No, Oliver said quickly, his voice urgent. If you tell him, he'll hurt me. He's been giving me medicine to keep me silent. He's been using me to steal money. Please. You have to believe me. Ruth shook her head, backing toward the door. I can't. I don't. Oliver grabbed her hand. Please. Just listen. Just for 5 minutes. Then if you don't believe me, you can leave and never come back. But please listen. Ruth stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she nodded. 5 minutes. Oliver took a deep breath. And then he told her everything. He told her about the medicine. About the conversations he had overheard. About the medical records in the study. About Grace being framed. About his father's plan to forge documents and steal millions. Ruth listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to horror. When Oliver finished, she sat down heavily on the edge of his bed. If what you're saying is true. It is true, Oliver said firmly. I can prove it. I have recordings. I have photos. But I need help. I need to reach Grace. She's the only other person who knows something is wrong. Ruth looked at him, her face pale. If I help you and your father finds out, I'll lose my job. Maybe worse. Oliver met her eyes. If you don't help me, an innocent woman's life is destroyed, and my father gets away with everything. Please. Ruth closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she opened them and looked at Oliver with a new expression. Resolve. Okay, she said quietly. I'll help you. But we have to be smart about this. Your father can't know. Not yet. Oliver felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't alone. Thank you, he whispered. Ruth stood up and picked up her cleaning supplies. I'll find out where Grace is staying. It might take a day or two. In the meantime, you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Act like nothing has changed. Can you do that? Oliver nodded. I've been doing it my whole life. Ruth gave him a small, sad smile. Not anymore. She left the room, and Oliver sat down on his bed, his heart pounding. He had taken the first step. He had spoken. He had asked for help. And someone had listened. The silent boy was finding his voice. And soon, the world would hear what he had to say. Ruth moved through the house for the next 2 days as if nothing had changed. She cleaned, cooked, and went about her duties with the same efficiency as always. But everything had changed. She now knew the truth about Oliver, and that knowledge weighed on her like a stone. Every time she saw Thomas, she had to fight to keep her expression neutral. Every time she passed Oliver's room, she wanted to check on him, to make sure he was okay. But she couldn't risk raising suspicion. Thomas was a careful man, observant and controlling. One wrong move and everything would fall apart. On the second evening after Oliver had spoken to her, Ruth left the mansion as usual at 6 o'clock. She drove her old sedan down the long driveway and through the iron gates. But instead of going home, she drove to a coffee shop on the other side of town. She had made some calls, asked some careful questions, and finally found out where Grace was staying. Grace had taken refuge with a former coworker named Linda, a woman who had worked briefly at the Garrett mansion years ago. Linda lived in a small apartment complex near the industrial district. Ruth parked her car and walked up to the second floor, finding apartment 2C. She knocked softly. The door opened a crack, and Grace's tired face appeared. Her eyes were red, her hair uncombed. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. When she saw Ruth, confusion crossed her face. Ruth? What are you doing here? Ruth glanced down the hallway to make sure no one was watching. Can I come in? I need to talk to you. It's about Oliver. Grace's expression changed immediately. She opened the door wider and let Ruth inside. The apartment was small and cluttered. Linda was at work, so they were alone. Grace led Ruth to the tiny kitchen table and they sat down. What's happened? Grace asked, her voice filled with worry. Is Oliver okay? Ruth took a deep breath. Grace, What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. But I need you to listen to everything before you respond. Grace nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly together. Ruth began. Oliver can speak. He can hear. He's been able to do both all along. Grace's mouth opened but no sound came out. She stared at Ruth like the words didn't make sense. That's impossible. He's been deaf and mute since birth. Thomas said. Thomas lied. Ruth interrupted. Oliver told me himself. He spoke to me 2 days ago. He's been pretending this whole time because his father has been drugging him. Medicine that suppresses his hearing and speech. Thomas has been doing it for 12 years. Grace stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. No, that can't be true. Why would a father do that to his own child? Ruth's voice was steady. Money. Thomas has been using Oliver's condition to access a medical research fund worth millions. The entire public campaign, the legal battle, all of it is a scam. Oliver is the key to the whole thing. As long as he stays silent and helpless, no one questions the story. Grace put her hand over her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Oh my God. I knew something was wrong. I knew it. But I never imagined. Ruth continued. Oliver has been gathering evidence. Recordings of Thomas and his lawyer discussing the plan. Photos of medical documents that prove there's no real condition. He wants to expose them. But he needs help. He needs you. Grace sank back into her chair, her mind racing. The document. The one Thomas said I stole. It never existed, did it? Ruth shook her head. No. Thomas made up the theft to buy more time and to get you out of the way. You were getting too close to the truth. Grace's hands clenched into fists. That man destroyed my life. I lost everything. My job, my home, my reputation. People think I'm a thief. And all of it was a lie. I know, Ruth said quietly. And that's why we need to stop him. But we have to be smart. Thomas is powerful. He has lawyers, money, and influence. If we go to the police without solid evidence, he'll bury us. Grace wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. What does Oliver need me to do? Ruth explained the plan that she and Oliver had discussed in whispered conversations over the past 2 days. Oliver had been recording Thomas and Monica's conversations, capturing fragments of their conspiracy. But he needed one final piece. A full, clear confession that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. And there was only one place they could get it. The upcoming court hearing. In 2 weeks, Thomas would present his case again. He would bring a forged document claiming Oliver's eligibility for the research fund. If that document was accepted, the funds would be released and Thomas would disappear with the money. But if Oliver appeared in that courtroom and spoke, if he revealed the truth in front of a judge, reporters, and witnesses, Thomas wouldn't be able to escape. The plan was risky. Oliver would have to continue pretending until the day of the hearing. He would have to keep taking the medicine in front of his father and secretly disposing of it. He would have to act silent and helpless while his hearing grew stronger and his voice grew clearer. And then, at the critical moment, he would break his silence and expose everything. Grace listened to the entire plan, her expression shifting from shock to determination. This could work, she said slowly. But Thomas will try to stop him. The moment Oliver starts speaking, Thomas will try to discredit him, claim the boy is confused or lying. Ruth nodded. That's why we need the recordings. Oliver has hours of Thomas and Monica discussing the scam. If we can play those in court, combined with Oliver's testimony, there will be no way to deny it. Grace stood up and paced the small kitchen. We also need to get the medical records. The ones that prove Oliver was never actually sick. Those documents are in Thomas's study. Ruth hesitated. That's the dangerous part. We'd have to break into the house and get them. If Thomas catches us... Grace stopped pacing and looked at Ruth with fierce determination. Then we don't get caught. Over the next week, Grace and Ruth worked together carefully. Ruth continued her job at the mansion, acting as if nothing had changed. She passed messages to Oliver when it was safe, letting him know that Grace was involved and the plan was moving forward. Oliver felt a surge of hope every time Ruth gave him an update. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies. People who believed him. People who were willing to fight for him. During that week, Oliver continued his routine. Every morning, Thomas entered with the brown bottle. Every morning, Oliver swallowed the medicine and spit it out the moment his father left. His hearing was now almost completely restored. He could hear conversations from 2 floors away. He could distinguish between the sound of Thomas's footsteps and Ruth's. He could hear the birds outside, the wind in the trees, the distant hum of traffic beyond the gates. And his voice was getting stronger. He practiced every night, speaking quietly to himself in the darkness of his room. He recited everything he would say in court. He practiced speaking clearly, confidently, without hesitation. He couldn't afford to stumble when the moment came. One night, exactly 1 week before the hearing, Ruth and Grace put their plan into action. Ruth had left the back door of the mansion unlocked before finishing her shift. At midnight, when Thomas was asleep and the house was dark, Grace slipped inside. Oliver was waiting by his bedroom door, listening. He heard Grace's careful footsteps on the stairs. He opened his door quietly and stepped into the hallway. Their eyes met for the first time in weeks. Grace's face crumpled and tears streamed down her cheeks. She rushed forward and pulled Oliver into a tight hug. Oliver hugged her back, feeling emotions he had suppressed for years finally breaking free. Grace pulled back and looked at him, her hands on his shoulders. She whispered, "Are you okay?" Oliver nodded. Then he whispered back, "I'm okay. Thank you for coming back." Grace wiped her eyes. "I never wanted to leave. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Oliver shook his head. "You did protect me. You cared when no one else did. Now we're going to finish this." Grace nodded. "Where's the study?" Oliver led her downstairs, moving silently through the dark house. They reached the study and Grace used a small flashlight to navigate. She found the filing cabinet Oliver had described and carefully picked the lock using a tool she had brought. Inside, she found the medical folder. She pulled out her phone and photographed every page, making sure every word was captured clearly. The documents were damning. Prescription records showing sedatives given to a healthy child. Handwritten notes admitting there was no neurological disorder. Financial records showing payments to doctors who had falsified reports. It was all there. Everything they needed. Grace put the folder back exactly as she found it and closed the cabinet. She turned to Oliver and nodded. They made their way back upstairs. Before Grace left, she hugged Oliver one more time. "One more week," she whispered. "Can you hold on for one more week?" Oliver looked at her with eyes that were no longer empty. "I've held on for 12 years. One more week is nothing." Grace smiled through her tears. "You're so brave." Oliver shook his head. "I'm just tired of being silent." Grace slipped out of the house the same way she came in, disappearing into the night. Oliver returned to his room and lay down on his bed, his heart pounding. The pieces were in place. The evidence was gathered. Now all they had to do was wait for the right moment. The week passed slowly. Every day felt like an eternity. Thomas continued his routine, completely unaware that his son could hear every word he said. Monica visited twice, and both times Oliver listened to their conversations through the vent. They talked about the forged document, about their escape plan, about the offshore accounts where they would hide the money. They talked about Oliver like he was a tool, a means to an end, nothing more. Each conversation made Oliver more certain that what he was about to do was right. The night before the hearing, Oliver couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, rehearsing everything he would say. He thought about all the people his father had hurt. Grace, who had been framed and humiliated. The families who had donated money believing they were helping a sick child. The public who had been manipulated and lied to. And himself. 12 years stolen. 12 years of silence. 12 years of being treated like he didn't matter. Tomorrow all of that would end. The morning of the hearing, Thomas entered Oliver's room earlier than usual. He was already dressed in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled. He carried the brown bottle as always. "Big day today, Oliver," Thomas said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "We're going to court. You'll come with me. Just sit quietly like you always do. Don't react to anything. Don't move unless I tell you to. Understand?" Oliver nodded, keeping his face blank. Thomas poured the medicine into the spoon and held it out. Open. Oliver opened his mouth. Thomas administered the liquid and watched carefully. Oliver swallowed, letting some of it go down to make it look real. Thomas seemed satisfied. He patted Oliver's head like one might pat a dog. Good boy. Get dressed. We leave in 30 minutes. Thomas left the room. Oliver immediately went to the bathroom and spit out what little medicine he had actually swallowed. He rinsed his mouth and looked at himself in the mirror. Today was the day. Today, the silent boy would speak. Oliver dressed in the clothes Thomas had laid out for him. A simple button-down shirt and dress pants. He looked like the perfect victim. Innocent, helpless, sympathetic. Exactly what Thomas wanted. But underneath that appearance was something Thomas had never expected. 30 minutes later, Oliver was led downstairs. A car was waiting outside. Thomas and Monica were already inside. Oliver climbed in and sat quietly in the back seat. No one spoke to him. No one even looked at him. He was invisible just like always. The drive to the courthouse took 40 minutes. Oliver watched the city pass by through the window. He had rarely left the mansion in his life. Everything outside felt strange and overwhelming. But he focused on what was ahead. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Reporters and cameras were everywhere. The moment Thomas stepped out of the car, he was swarmed. Microphones were shoved in his face. Questions were shouted from every direction. Monica walked beside him, both of them wearing expressions of tired determination. Oliver was led out of the car by a security guard. Cameras turned toward him. Photographers took pictures. A few reporters shouted questions at him, but he didn't react. He kept his head down and his face expressionless, playing the role one last time. Inside the courthouse, they were led to a private room to wait. Thomas and Monica spoke in low voices, going over their strategy. Oliver sat in the corner, silent and still. He could hear everything they were saying, but he gave no indication. An hour later, they were called into the courtroom. The gallery was packed. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. The judge sat at the bench, looking stern and exhausted. Thomas, Monica, and Oliver took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, lawyers representing the Research Funds Oversight Committee sat stiffly, prepared to argue against the release of funds. The judge called the session to order and asked Monica to present her case. Monica stood and delivered a passionate opening statement. She spoke about Oliver's condition, about the urgent need for treatment, about the injustice of bureaucratic delays. She painted Thomas as a devoted father fighting an uphill battle. Then she held up a folder. Your Honor, I am prepared to present the confidential medical document that proves beyond any doubt that Oliver Garrett meets all eligibility requirements for the research fund. The judge gestured for her to approach. Monica walked forward and handed over the folder. The judge opened it and began reading. The courtroom was silent. Everyone waited. Oliver's heart pounded. This was it. The forged document. The final lie. After several minutes, the judge looked up. This appears to be in order. However, given the unusual circumstances of this case, I'd like to hear from an independent medical expert before making a final ruling. Monica's face tightened, but she nodded. Of course, Your Honor. The judge turned to the Oversight Committee's lawyers. Do you have any objections or additional evidence to present? One of the lawyers stood. Your Honor, we maintain that the circumstances of this case are highly irregular. We request additional time to verify the authenticity of the submitted documents. The judge considered this. I'll grant a 2-week continuance for verification. We'll reconvene. No. The word cut through the courtroom like a blade. Everyone froze. Heads turned. The judge looked up, confused. Thomas's face went white. Monica's mouth fell open. The word had come from Oliver. He had spoken. Out loud. In front of everyone. Oliver stood up slowly. His legs were shaking, but his voice was clear. No more delays. No more lies. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted. Cameras flashed. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Order in this court. Thomas grabbed Oliver's arm. Sit down. Now. Oliver pulled his arm away and looked at his father. I'm done sitting down. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, my name is Oliver Garrett. I can hear you. I can speak. I've been able to do both my entire life. The courtroom fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The judge stared at Oliver, stunned. Young man, are you saying? I'm saying my father has been lying about everything, Oliver said, his voice growing stronger. I don't have a neurological disorder. I never did. My father has been drugging me for 12 years to keep me silent. He's been using me to steal money from the research fund. Thomas stood up, his face red. This is absurd. The boy is confused. I'm not confused, Oliver said firmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. I have proof. Monica tried to intervene. Your Honor, this is clearly some kind of episode. The boy has been under tremendous stress. Oliver pressed play on the recorder. Thomas's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. As long as Oliver stays silent, no one can question the story. The medicine makes sure of that. Then Monica's voice. You've been giving him that sedative for 12 years. What if someone finds out? Thomas again. No one will find out. I control who sees him. I control his medical records. Oliver is the perfect victim. Silent, sympathetic, and completely under my control. The courtroom exploded again. Reporters were typing frantically. People in the gallery were shouting. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly. Silence. Everyone be silent or I'll clear this courtroom. Thomas's face had gone from red to pale. He looked at Oliver with an expression of pure shock and rage. Monica had sat down, her head in her hands. The judge looked at Oliver. Is there more? Oliver nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Recordings of my father and Ms. Pierce planning to forge documents, to steal the research funds, and to disappear with the money. I also have photographs of medical records proving I was never sick. He looked at Grace, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom. She had been crying, but now she stood up. Your Honor, my name is Grace Whitman. I'm the housemaid who was falsely accused of theft. I can corroborate everything Oliver is saying. I have additional evidence, medical documents that show Oliver was prescribed sedatives, not treatment for a neurological condition. The judge turned to the court officers. I want Mr. Garrett and Ms. Pierce detained immediately. No one leaves this courtroom. Security officers moved forward. Thomas tried to run, but he was grabbed before he reached the door. Monica didn't resist. She just sat there, defeated. The judge looked at Oliver, his expression a mixture of shock and compassion. Son, are you telling me this has been going on for 12 years? Oliver nodded, tears finally streaming down his face. Yes, sir. He took my voice. He took my childhood. He used me like I wasn't even human. The judge's face hardened. He turned to Thomas, who was now in handcuffs. Mr. Garrett, you are being detained pending criminal investigation into charges of child abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Ironic, isn't it? Oliver said quietly. Thomas looked at him, and for the first time, Oliver saw something close to fear in his father's eyes. The proceedings continued for another hour. Evidence was presented, statements were taken. Oliver told his story in full, and Grace provided supporting testimony. Medical experts were called in to examine the recordings and documents. By the end of the day, the case had transformed from a civil matter into a criminal investigation. Thomas and Monica were formally arrested and taken into custody. The research fund was frozen pending a full audit. And Oliver was placed temporarily in the care of social services, with Grace approved as his temporary guardian. As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. But this time, the questions were different. Oliver, how does it feel to finally speak? What do you want people to know? Oliver looked at the cameras. He thought about all the years of silence. All the pain, the isolation, the control. And then he thought about this moment. About standing in a courtroom and telling the truth. About finally being heard. He spoke clearly, his voice steady. I want people to know that silence isn't always what it seems. Sometimes people are silent because they're forced to be. Because someone has taken their voice away. But voices can be found again. And when they are, the truth comes out. The reporters wrote down every word. That night, Oliver sat in Grace's small apartment. Linda had made dinner, and the three of them ate together at the tiny kitchen table. It was the first real meal Oliver had eaten in years. Food that wasn't measured or controlled. Conversation that wasn't one-sided. Laughter that wasn't forbidden. After dinner, Oliver stood by the window and looked out at the city. Grace came and stood beside him. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Oliver thought about the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everything feels different. The world is so loud now. There's so much I don't know how to process." Grace put her hand on his shoulder. "You'll learn. And I'll be here to help you." Oliver looked at her. "But why did you help me when everyone else gave up?" Grace smiled. "Because I saw you, Oliver. Not the story your father told. Not the silent boy everyone thought you were. I saw you. The real you. And I knew that boy deserved better." Oliver felt tears well up again. He had cried more in the past 12 hours than he had in his entire life. But these tears felt different. They felt like release. "Thank you," he whispered. Grace pulled him into a hug. "You saved yourself, Oliver. You found your voice. You told your truth. I'm just proud I got to be part of it." Over the next few weeks, the story dominated headlines. Thomas Garrett and Monica Pierce were charged with multiple felonies including fraud, child abuse, conspiracy, and forgery. The trial was set for 6 months later, but with the evidence Oliver had gathered, the outcome seemed certain. The research fund was audited and reformed. New oversight measures were put in place to prevent similar fraud in the future. And Oliver began the long process of healing. He started therapy to deal with the trauma of 12 years of abuse. He began speech therapy, not because he couldn't speak, but because he had never properly learned how to use his voice. He was enrolled in school for the first time in his life, starting several grades behind where he should have been, but determined to catch up. Grace officially became his legal guardian. They moved into a small house on the edge of the city. It wasn't a mansion. It didn't have 12 bedrooms or security gates. But it was warm. It was safe. And it was home. One evening, 6 months after the courtroom revelation, Oliver and Grace were sitting on their porch watching the sunset. Oliver had grown several inches. His face had color. His eyes had light. He looked like a different person. "Grace," Oliver said quietly. "Yes. Do you think I'll ever stop being angry at him?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. But I don't think that's the right question." "What is?" "I think the question is whether you'll let that anger define you. Your father tried to control your entire life. Don't let him control your future too." Oliver thought about that. "How do I stop him?" Grace smiled. "By living. By being everything he said you couldn't be. By using your voice for good things. By being happy." Oliver nodded slowly. "I think I can do that." "I know you can." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Oliver said, "I'm going to be a lawyer." Grace looked at him, surprised. "A lawyer?" Oliver nodded. "I want to help other people who've been silenced. People who need someone to speak up for them. I want to use my voice to give voice to others." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I think that's a beautiful goal." Oliver smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "I spent 12 years silent. I'm going to spend the rest of my life speaking." Several months later, Thomas Garrett's trial concluded. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Monica Pierce received 15 years. The story made national news one final time. And in the coverage, Oliver gave one final interview. The reporter asked him what he wanted people to remember about his story. Oliver thought carefully before answering. "I want people to remember that silence can be broken. That lies, no matter how carefully constructed, will eventually fall apart when confronted with truth. And that one voice, even a voice that's been suppressed for years, can change everything." The reporter asked one last question. "What would you say to other children who are suffering in silence, who feel like they can't speak up?" Oliver looked directly into the camera. "I would say this: your voice matters. Even if no one is listening right now, your voice matters. Even if you've been told you're powerless, you're not. The truth is powerful. And when you're ready, when you find the courage to speak it, people will listen. Don't give up. Don't stay silent. The world needs to hear what you have to say. The interview ended, but Oliver's message spread across the country. It inspired other victims to come forward. It sparked conversations about child abuse and parental manipulation. It changed laws and reformed systems. And most importantly, it gave hope to countless children who felt voiceless and alone. Years later, Oliver Garrett graduated from law school at the top of his class. Grace was in the front row, crying tears of pride. He went on to become one of the country's leading advocates for child welfare and victims' rights. He won cases. He changed policies. He gave voice to the voiceless. And every single day, he used the voice that had been stolen from him for 12 years. He used it to fight, to protect, to speak truth. He used it to be everything his father said he couldn't be. Because Oliver Garrett had learned something that his father never understood. Silence isn't weakness. But breaking that silence? That takes courage. That takes strength. That takes a voice. And once you find that voice, no one can ever take it away again. If this story moved you, if you believe that every child deserves protection and every voice deserves to be heard, then subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button if you stand against those who silence the innocent. Comment, "Every voice matters," if you believe no one should suffer in silence. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, one story can change everything. Thank you for watching Every Mind Stories. We'll see you in the next one. Remember, your voice matters. Use it.